Welcome back, Timeline. It has been a while. So, if you don't remember, I'm your host, Tania. I'm a lifelong, highly online girly, and this is the most interesting people on my timeline, a podcast where I am dedicated to exploring the digital space and how it affects the lives and work of my most interesting online friends. If you're new here, welcome. On this podcast, we talk about social media, internet culture, hot topics in the digital space, but most importantly, we talk about it with interesting people in various fields that I've had the pleasure of engaging with IRL and online. If you're not new here, thank you for showing up and showing out for our return. I'm excited to introduce you guys to more interesting people, and we're actually moving away from the model of doing seasons so that hopefully the breaks in between episodes will be shorter. And also we have a new logo which inspired this new microphone if you're watching the visual version. And thank you to Maida for collaborating with me on that. So welcome to the revamped era for this podcast. I'm so glad y'all stayed, or if y'all are just joining, I'm so glad you're here. As always, you can listen to all the episodes anywhere you get your podcast. You can also watch a visual version on Spotify and on YouTube. And you can find links to all of this and more info on today's guest in the description box of whatever platform you're listening on. You can find all the links to today's episode in the description box of whatever platform you're listening on. But also, you can go to taniadoes.com/interesting people, which Maida also revamped, and you'll find episode recaps there and links. You can also visit our new base for our supporters, buymeacoffee.com/taniadoes, where you can make a one-time contribution, or you can join us on a monthly basis, and it's got some cute little perks with that too. So make sure to check those out. Today's episode features Washington State-based creator and the host of Shot of Truth podcast, and just an amazing human being overall, Vicky Matey. And you can find more info about Vicky and Vicky's work at taniadoes.com/Vicky Matey. Welcome to this long overdue episode of the most interesting people on my timeline. Let me introduce y'all to Vicky.
Hello, everybody. My name is Victoria Matey. Thank you, Tania, for inviting me to be on the most interesting people on my timeline podcast. I'm super excited to be here with y'all today. A little bit about myself is I am calling from Nooksack and Lummi territories, also known as Bellingham, Washington, really close to the border here towards Canada. A lot of the work I do, honestly, it's kind of all over the place. I've done so much work as like an international speaker in my eyes, being an educator in the immigrant movement. I've done some podcast work with Shot of Truth podcast, where I've had the opportunity to connect and build relationships with so many amazing people from across the nation that are doing super badass things, just like yourself. Oh my gosh, and so much more. I currently work for Scholar Fund as a communications manager, and it is so awesome and so complex and always learning from people. I would also say, like, I am a creator. I'm an Aquarius. I'm a deep thinker. I'm somebody that's like always contemplating and asking questions and wanting to learn more and understand more. And I'm also somebody that's experiencing a lot of grief and like learning from that and taking that with me everywhere I go, because I think it's so important to existence in life. So yeah, those are the things that come to mind.
I find that I tend to like the people that I invite on tend to be very multifaceted. So like you were just like kind of listing everything that you are, and I think that that's why we connected a lot, because we both work in different spaces and like they kind of connect to us as who we are. And like we met in person during the Cultural Leadership Fellowship, uh which is how I was able to go abroad this past summer. But I actually had first heard about you through your podcast work and Shot of Truth. So do you want to talk a little bit more about your journey with your podcast?
Yes. So it's so funny because I always tell people that Shot of Truth podcast was not my idea. It was one of my friends who is like a super nerd, like white dude that was like, I really want to start a podcast, but I have nothing to talk about, but you do. And at this point, I had already been speaking all over the country for like, I want to say 7 years at that point. And so I was like, I guess like podcast back then, like we came out, oh, man, when did we start? I want to say it was 2018. Weren't as poppin' and as, mainstream as they are now. So I was kind of like hesitant about it. But as soon as we started doing it, I absolutely fell in love with it. I fell in love with it because I was constantly learning from the research I was doing, from the people I was meeting, And it was also an opportunity to learn about myself and see how so much of this work is really impacted by who I am, what I'm thinking, what I'm experiencing, and just like growing with it. So that's kind of how it all started, and it's been for almost 5 years now with the podcast, which is mind-boggling. And I have, I feel so much joy thinking about how many people I've been able to connect with, how many people I've been able to learn from, how many people I've continued to have relationships with, because of creating spaces where we can have critical dialogue that I think is part of the healing. It's part of the justice work. It's part of how we continue to envision a future of liberation. And so the podcast has taken me on a long, long journey of so many things, and I feel so grateful to it because it is my baby. And also, like I mentioned previously, like, and I think I've only talked to you about this too, is that like after losing my dad, it's been so hard to come back to that work. And is it because I'm more vulnerable than before? Is it because I have I'm thinking about the world differently now? Is it because I'm still deeply healing that I can't like get myself there? And I don't know the answer to that yet. But I think that's important to mention because it has been something that has been so a part of me, and I have felt kind of lost in not doing it as much as I love to do over the last year.
I think that it's funny that our podcasts were kind of like started the same way, where it wasn't also either my idea to do it as a podcast. It was like someone I was interviewing was like, this should be a podcast, and it came out of that. But also just like how I admire how long you've been doing it, because I was scrolling down like in like my research just through the Shot of Truth podcast like Instagram, and y'all have been going on for a while, which is like it's fun to see that progression through y'all's page into like what it is now and how many people that you've been able to connect with. But also yeah, like talking about like vulnerability, and because your podcast is also very personal and you talk about a lot about personal things with your guests. So like, I mean, a question that comes out of that for me is like, maybe in the past it was easier to make episodes or like do episodes more often because the topics, while they were still personal, they weren't as personal as how they are now or as vulnerable as they are now.
So I definitely think there's been a progression in the episodes, as early on it was just me and somebody else talking about different topics and ideas we had. And I think something that really hit me while I was doing podcast work is like it's actually not about you at all, and about like handing over the mic and creating space for other people to do so. And so one of my goals was to make the podcast a collective and community led work. And though I was leading the efforts and doing all of the, like organizing, research, social media stuff, and working with Caleb Nelson, who is the producer of the podcast, yeah, I started to learn so much about other people and the vulnerability of it. And it's always been vulnerable. It's always been personal. Like I can't think of an episode that I interviewed where it wasn't like there was that moment, right? And I listened to this podcast recently, and it was Audrey Marie Brown, and she was with somebody else, and they were talking about how we're never satisfied as a society. And they talked about how like satisfaction comes when you get that tingle feeling up your spine, where you're like connecting with somebody, when you're present with somebody, when you're learning from somebody. And that has been like ringing to my core, because so much of the work that I've done with Shot of Truth podcast has been around vulnerability and connection, and and healing work, right? But I also didn't realize that in those moments of togetherness, there was something more that was happening. So, I can't say like things were less vulnerable then than they are now. I just think that I'm introducing and talking about a topic now that is not talked about enough, that is not talked about in immigrant communities enough, that is not talked about to the extent that we should be talking about it. And that being grief, that being alcoholism. And so as somebody that has this platform, I'm inviting those topics that can be difficult to talk about and difficult to confront.
And I actually really appreciate it, because I think I started following you around that time when this was happening with your father's passing. And it like when I was listening to the episode, especially with you and Maggie from Oda, it was like it was like on the plane from Lisbon to Paris, and I had to like stop midway to like not like cry on the plane because it is something that like I think my parents dealt with their parents, specifically my dad, and he just doesn't talk about it. So hearing people talk about it who like had shared that, it was like, yeah, like you said, it's not really talked about. So I really appreciate that in your work. And like one of the questions that like I had was that, and that's something maybe I struggle with is I'm maybe like I don't share as much as like I would like to for fear of being vulnerable publicly. Is just how do you approach like posting that kind of like very personal stuff while it's still intertwined with like your work or like a business setting?
It's really difficult, um, especially when you're overthinking it, because sometimes I do that. I'm definitely like I was just telling you before this, like I'm an anxious person brought to me by my undocumentedness. And so like I do often question like who is listening to this? Like who has access to this? Who like now believes that they know me and get, like it's just like it is difficult to that aspect. And also like I'm in it for the healing aspect of it. I'm in it for having dialogue with people. I'm in it to learn with people and engage with people, and build relationships too. Like you said, like you and I met on a trip in Europe and here we are now, right? And so I think what I benefit so much from being vulnerable is being seen, finding community, and just like I don't know, I think vulnerability and authenticity is the key to so many things. And so I do it with an open heart, and I tell people like you don't have to agree with me if you don't want to. I don't care. Like, but like where can we meet together? Like where can we meet and really have a conversation about what moves us, what changed us, and what we're thinking about and envisioning for the future. So it all goes hand in hand, and I absolutely love when people feel comfortable with me to be vulnerable, to talk about the hard things, and even if in that moment I don't know how to respond, I can say that. I can say like I need a moment, or that was difficult, or like what do you need now? So I think always, entering those conversations with an open heart has been how I navigate that.
Yeah, like I said, I kind of feel like I struggled with that just because with like trying to get people to agree with me or try not to say the wrong thing because of like especially online. Like I think on my podcast I tried to bring that aspect back because I am someone who has been like in like online and meeting people online for a while and wanted a little bit more of that. But it was because of something that happened online that I was like very traumatized to share a lot about who I was. And it's a video that I still have up, but it was a video about me like getting into Harvard while having DACA and like a bunch of like very right wing like Trump era people like finding that video and like not agreeing with me, and they're like adults and they were like saying mean things. Now I think I have grown a lot from that, but I think there's still something stemming from that interaction when I was like 17, 18 that carries on to now.
Right, right. And I think that as somebody that has been putting themselves out there for a long time, I've experienced a lot of those things too. And very locally. For example, like I was just at the grocery store with my partner and I was like, "Oh my God, that guy over there like is a Trump supporter and came to like talk against Blue Group and the undocu work we were doing at this, so it's like it carries with you, like you bring that stuff with you, and you have to decide like how you engage with it then and there. Which, for me it's like stay away, don't engage. I have nothing to prove to those people or say to those people. I'm not going to change their mind. I don't care to. Like I'm here to cultivate community and conversations, not to give light and energy to the right wing folks that just don't give a shit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that was, I think, the easiest part for me to process. The harder part was when it was coming from like people within the community or like, yeah, where I was like, dang, I have to be in space with these people. Actually, like, I don't have to engage with like people, like, especially coming in the South, like, I learned a lot of how to like deal with folks like that. But then when those people will have to be in community with in certain spaces, that was hard for me. I don't know if you've had that too, that experience as well.
I definitely have, and it is hard for the reason that like it was never your intention to create conflict or
Yeah.
tension out of being vulnerable, right? And it's unfortunate that there's people that are also undocumented and immigrants that want to essentially put people down because of their vulnerability and because of their willingness to share and be open. And it's hard because nowadays social media is not a nice platform. It is very awful, right? People thrive off saying awful things to people. And so I think, it's complex. And I think one of the ways that we get to move past that is by creating our own platforms, creating our own spaces where we can have these conversations and nobody can tell us how, what, who, when, what, and what, any of that. Like, it's just like, it just is. And I think that's what's so important about platforms like yours and platforms like mine is that nobody gets to come on here and tell us you're wrong. You didn't do that right. I don't like the way you did that. Well, guess what? You can start your own podcast if that's the case.
Exactly, exactly. And I feel like in the medium that we are in, podcast, it is very like you said, just start your own podcast. Like anyone has been starting their own podcast and just saying anything, and like you can just ignore it or engage with it however you want. Maybe that brings us to like the next question that I had, which was about traveling abroad and like social media use, because that question stemmed from I had been in situations where people are like, like overposting and you're undocu and you're not, but you're also not. Like this is triggering for me if I see this, versus also having people be like, no, like I want you to post like I'm living through you, and trying to balance that out. So I remember like before I went on the fellowship in advance with Advanced Pro with y'all, I had posted on my story like, if you block me in my stories right now, like I completely like that's fine. I understand. And just throwing that out there for people who were following me, and like so they could choose how to engage with what I was posting, because I didn't want to limit myself, but I also wanted to be cognizant of it. So I don't know like what your relationship was with posting and social media while we were traveling abroad.
So before I answer that question, I'm going to say that Tania and I met in Europe,
Mm-hmm.
traveling with the Cultural Leadership Fellowship at a Scholar Fund. We did some awesome things together. And for some reason, like sometimes when you see people, you just know you vibe with them. And that's how I felt about Tania. And so Tania and I were, checking out the speakeasies, having, important conversations of our own experiences, but also like things we didn't even know about, right? And so I want to say that on this trip, we got to really know each other and yeah, I absolutely feel so happy with all the people that were a part of our cohort and the amount of community care and love that came from all of it. And I'm so glad that we connected on that end. In terms of social media, there's always duality. I always think of duality because you have to think of, like you said, the people that are hurt and or feel some sort of heaviness, complex emotions around seeing you travel, as they can be undocumented as well as you're undocumented as a DACA recipient. And then, like you said, the folks that really want to see it, that are living through you, that are happy, right? And I think that people are on that spectrum at different points of their lives based off how much work they've done, based off situations, right? Like I think it's also very like objective and also like situational. And so like I don't think that people are on either side of the way because it's right or wrong. I think acknowledging it is super crucial. And I was just telling you that, there was very few people that took the time to like to name that and say that. And you were one of them, a couple other folks, and myself saying that, there's complex emotions and feelings and being in those spaces, those colonizing spaces and spaces that took from our communities and impacted millions of Black immigrants and live and being in spaces that, originally we wouldn't take space in. And so it's a little bit of everything and both. Um, there was also a lot of uprisings in Paris when we were there, and posting about that. It felt weird. It felt wrong almost to be a tourist in Paris as that was happening, and just posting, that we were here and that we were there, but reclaiming that because it was our only opportunity to do so, be there and experience that. So like again, it's a duality. There's no right or wrong response or way. But I think being a conscious person to name it, and to respond to it, I think is good. So
I also remember just like speaking more towards the fellowship than this is like we had such extensive talks about when we were going to Paris. For context, the Europe cohort for the fellowship, we were in Lisbon for 5 days, and then we were going to Paris for 5 days. And I remember having like conversations in Lisbon about like, you know, how much of it is like, one, is it safe for us to go? And then two is like, what does it mean if we do go, if it is safe and we still choose to go? And I think my mindset of it was like knowing that a lot of the issues that were going on in Paris were present before these specific situations and like uprisings, and I was still willing to go to Paris knowing that before this was one, and like the reasons behind that also just kind of like maybe put it at ease that like intention was also important if we decided to go. And I think Noonie was who was one of the people on the fellowship also put it towards of like, if this is my experience in Paris, like that's my experience in Paris, like even if it isn't the touristic space, like I'm still gonna go and be there. Yeah, that really stuck with me even after.
yo, I'm so glad you said that, because that's exactly what I was thinking about just now, was Noonie saying that, right? That like if we were going to experience it that way, that's the way that we were meant to experience it, and that was okay. You know, if anything, that was more real of Paris than all the romanticization and all of the attractions and all of that.
Yeah, because I think, and to bring social media back into this, I romanticize the fuck out of these places like before I went. And so going there and being like, okay, this is like reality, this is what it would be, was actually kind of grounding for me.
Hmm. I had never even like, I didn't know very much about Paris and or Lisboa or anything, you know, and so I was really more along for the ride and excited about it, and I got to learn so much about, you know, people, communication, body language, the way that we can take up space, you know. It was just, it was so amazing to experience with you. And yeah, I just want to say that you hella impacted my trip, and I'm stoked about it.
Yeah. No, you did too, because I will always bring it to that speakeasy. Any of the speakeasy moments. We went to two speakeasies in Paris and just had like really awesome conversations just about a lot of things. And like one of the main ones was like realizing that like I hadn't really been in community with a lot of people who were like older than me, um, especially like undocumented folks who were older than me in general. And so I felt like I had gained so many like, I don't want to say mentors because y'all aren't like that much older than me. Like, but like
I'm like, Tanya.
but like older siblings, I guess, because I'm the oldest in my family, so no, I didn't really have that. So I feel like this was the first time I was getting that, being like one of the younger people in the cohort. And the way that also I hadn't even realized y'all were actually older than me until y'all kept bringing it up. But like that, it was like a really good moment. I think the moments in the speakeasy solidified that for me.
Mhm. And I don't know why I think about this moment, but it was the moment we all got gelato and we just sat on these stairs and we were all just exhausted, didn't walk anymore. We were just like, is this it? Like, is this Paris? And literally it just felt like one of those moments where you're with a bunch of people and it feels normal and good to just exist together and not have to, you know, fill in the blanks or, you know, perform or whatever it is, right? So I don't know why I come to that moment too.
No, I love that because it brings up of like when I was like worried about posting it like before I left, I was like, I don't also want to like censor myself or like restrict myself in posting. I don't want to like necessarily romanticize it either, but also like I'm having a good time. Like I want to post my little Paris European summer on social media. Um, but yeah, it's those moments like that are the times when we talked about this a lot, where like rest was also, and the stopping moments were so important than trying to like fit everything in one go just because we think that this experience for us was very limited. Yeah, I don't know. That's a big takeaway for me. It's like those moments of rest allowed me to enjoy everything else a little bit more.
You know, as I'm listening to you talk, I'm thinking about how undocu folks always have to carry multiple emotions.
Mhm.
One of them feeling proud and one of them feeling shame. One of them feeling, you know, like excited and also sad. And I think that it's unfair. It's unfair that we constantly have to live and carry multiple things instead of just being kind of in that present moment. And you know, as I was listening to you share that, like I want to share, you know, like my little summer European vacation too. Like white folks don't have to fucking think about that.
For real, exactly. Like they can just like go out and do it, and but we're like being cognizant of like how we're perceived because of this. Yeah, so
And I
true.
wonder if that really stems from us feeling so, especially young, you know, undocu folks and DACA recipients, the amount of pressure that is put on us to be exceptional, to be this, to be that, you know, and to be that optimal citizen in the making, you know, and it's so harmful. Like and you know, I see it in just the way that we constantly worry about that perception of others, and we are anxious. Like I said earlier, I'm like, I blame my anxiousness on being undocumented, you know. And so it's heavy and it's hard.
Yeah. No, like you said that and it clicked in my mind of like, wait, is this just me like projecting this pedestal? Because my family has had me on a pedestal for like a while because of a lot of stuff. And I just think, do I feel like am I just projecting that same sentiment my family had about me to like my friends online? Like, is that what I'm doing? And I'm like, perhaps, perhaps. Just as you said that, I realized.
You know, and I think one of the things that I asked you too was like, how do you like respond to people when you share some of your great accomplishments, right? And I think one of the things that you said to me was along the lines of like you doing your best to not like glorify it, and also doing your best to take up space and do it, because it is a huge accomplishment to go to Harvard, to do some of the projects you're doing, and in the spaces that you're in. So I hope that you're mostly proud of it and can just rock it, right?
Yeah, I think we were talking about that, and like my thing was trying to find that balance of like you said, not glorifying it while acknowledging like I did work hard to like do those stuff, and I did have such a good time, and I do have good and like proud moments in these spaces. But I think the balance for me came realizing that yes, I did work hard and I do deserve to be proud of this, knowing at the same time that like the way I don't glorify it is always grounding myself that like uh it's not that other people couldn't do these things because they also didn't work hard. It's like the system, it just like it is random sometimes of like I should be honest, like somebody could have done the same thing or more than me had they just like come to the country like a few years earlier or something. Like so always that keeps me humble, one, and then two, like but also realizing that we're of why we need to continue working together because it's not like a work ethic thing. It's not like a who's the model citizen thing. Sometimes it really is just a condition of the system that
Exactly.
those opportunities too. Maybe like we could talk a little bit more about like traveling and any feelings we had. I feel like on my for me Instagram and the stories were like sharing like the good fun things, just sharing like thoughts and reflections. But then so one of the things for the fellowship we all did afterwards was a project, and my project I shared a couple journal entries and photos on my website from the trip, and that's where I think I was a little bit more vulnerable. um so I don't know if you had a way of processing things similar to the final project being a lead for the fellowship.
Yeah, so I didn't have to do the project. So just so folks know, I support the program. Alejandra and Yudiana are the creators of the program, and people like Cindy and myself get to support their amazing work. Um, but since I didn't have a project like that, I didn't necessarily have the space to process that like that, you know, and I also was anticipating visiting my dad's family right after that too. And so there wasn't ever a moment to process. And as a lead, when you have downtime, you're not reflecting, you're not writing in your journal, you're fucking, I mean, that's not true. Like Cindy hella did that. I guess I was just on the phone with my fucking partner or like watching Never Have I Ever on Netflix. But yeah, so I don't necessarily think that I have fully processed the whole experience or the trip. And honestly, when it tying it a little bit back to the social media thing is like I haven't posted on like my Instagram or my Facebook a ton of photos of my family or things like that. And not because I don't want to, but because I selfishly want to keep them to myself, even though I do want to share that, you know? And so one of the moments that helped me at least process it a little bit, and I think there's more work to be done, was when I got back. I was talking with my life coach, and he said, now that you've experienced that, what would you tell your dad? And that was a moment of like, whoa, that all happened. And there's so many things I feel about traveling with advanced parole and traveling while COVID is still rampant and traveling while acknowledging your privilege and also, you know, being conscious of how other people's systems and or similar systems impact the community that's there. So there's just too much to unpack. It's not just fun and games. Again, this whole thing I'm fucking being undocumented. Like we couldn't just go and have fucking fun, right? And like now we have to process it and like think about what that means and like all that messy work.
And like when we get asked this question of like, so how was it, or like, well, how have you been processing, it's like some of it, yeah, I do have a lot of like feelings and emotions to process. Some of it I'm like, it was fun, I had a good time. That's it.
Yeah, totally.
Nothing more than that.
Yeah, I feel like I gave a very generic response to most people. Like, it was super fun, got to see cool things, met cool people. And then they'd be like, what else? And I'd be like, that's it. Like,
I had a silly goofy time, that's it.
but it wasn't that I didn't want to share. I think I just didn't know how to in the moment. And so many people ask because they're so curious and so happy for you that sometimes you're just like, oh my gosh, I've answered this question 20 times and I still don't have the right answer.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, because I feel like the question I got the most is like, oh, how did you feel? I was, I'm like, and like it was different for different places. Like Europe trip was way different than the trip I went for Mexico. And like I know for you must have been different too, because you've done AP. You also went to Mexico and Guatemala before last summer, I believe, right? With
just Guatemala.
oh, Guatemala, yes. And so like you also, you're gonna feel different every time you do AP. So yeah, there's like no one right answer. I feel like we did so much that we can't even like, it's like separate conversations for each thing too.
Oh my gosh. The one thing I tell people is like, if only you knew how much I walked. Like there was one day I walked 14 miles in Paris, you know? And so that was like one of the main things I kept bringing up is like Europe is a walking place. You walk everywhere. Here in the US, that's not the case. Yeah, so it's different in many ways. One, because I was going to Europe for work, right? Like,
Right.
yes, I got to experience all the amazing things y'all did and got to build a community and like have the fun, all of it. But it's different when you're the one leading the group, making sure everybody's on time, making sure everybody has what they need. If there's any hiccups, right? You're the person that is there to support. And so it was different going kind of like under that. Europe felt a lot more organized in that we had, you know, everyday plan, things paid for, like tours ready to go. Whereas in Mexico, it was very much more so existing and learning to navigate and exist as you were moving through it versus having like pre-context like plans and notions. Um, and Mexico too, like I think one of the things I'm still working through is like how we romanticize returning home and how sometimes like it isn't a pretty story and sometimes it isn't everything that you hoped for and or like the impact afterwards. Like there's so many people I've talked to, and I mean, this is true for a lot of people, is you get the traveler blues, right? When you return after traveling for so long. But it's different. Again, like it's different because we're undocumented, we're DACA recipients. Like coming back is comes with another layer of sadness of like, when will I return? Like now I have all this information. Now what do I do with it? Now I'm reconnected to all these people. How do I move forward with that? Like I feel like it's just different. So I'm still working through understanding that and trying to like make sense of it myself. But I think it was different in the sense that even though Europe required more of me physically, Mexico required so much more of me emotionally.
No, I feel that. I think we talked about this before to another conversation we have, or we had that like, our experiences in Mexico were just like, kind of like you said, you're learning so many new things. And for me, I shared that like I was learning a lot about my parents' past while my parents were not there. And like knowing my parents as completely different people than who they were when they left. And that was really weird reconciling that when I came back and like I saw them, like I kind of know some tea, but also, yeah.
I
So it's
love that.
like, yeah, like how do you reconcile the information that you learn that maybe
Right.
like they didn't talk about here? That's a big thing.
And you saying that reminds me, and this is something I wrote on my whiteboard because I'm going to repeat it in the future in one of my episodes, but that it helped me conceptualize that my parents had lives before the US,
Oh
that
yeah.
they had community, that they had places they loved to go, places they would eat at, places they'd go dancing, right? And because so much of this experience feels so, I guess, focused on the US, like I just like felt good knowing that my parents had a great life before coming to the US. And not that they were wealthy or well off or that they did a bunch of traveling or any of that, but that they didn't live under the circumstances that the US imposes on immigrants as we experience here now.
Also for me, I think that also happened because I found so many photos that I hadn't seen before. And even photos of my dad like early on when he'd first moved to the US where I was like, "What is this, dad? What is this?" But yeah, and like not, and it's weird. It came as like a shock to me because I'm like, there was so much of this life, but I hadn't even heard of it. It's like, why don't our parents talk about that? And so like that just makes me wonder. It wasn't anything traumatic that I found out or anything, but like, why didn't y'all tell me you were cool?
Right. Right. Totally. Totally. Yeah,
um,
like I saw a picture of my dad that I posted on social media and everybody was like, "Damn, your dad was good looking. Your dad was hot." I'm like, "Right?"
maybe I had the opposite. I found one of my dad when he was in his basketball phase, and he had shaved his head to try to, I guess, look like a basketball player in his eyes. I'm like, Dad, this is problematic for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Uh, it was more of that, but it was with something that I brought up with me and my mom though was like I was looking at photos of her and a lot of people who knew her back then were like, you look so much like your mom, like how I remember her. And so I'm like, oh, so when I grow up I'm going to look like my mom, like that slays. But she's always very detrimental about herself and like how
Mhm.
she looks. And so I've started telling her like, Mom, like I look like you and I'm gonna look like you. Like the more you're hard on yourself, like just think you're like that's how I'm gonna look like. And I think you're actually like so beautiful. So that's something that came out of that when I came back from Mexico with my mom.
I can relate to that a lot because I'm literally my mother's fucking twin.
Yeah.
Like we're twins. Like people will stop us in the street and be like, "Whoa." Um and so seeing my dad's family and seeing how much they loved my mom and how much grief they carried and missing my parents and like how much grief came up for them and seeing me that looks just like my mother, right? And so they would kept saying, "Eres toda Katy," because they call her Katy. Her name's Catalina. "Eres toda Katy. You even dance like Katy, like everything, you know." And I was just like, I'm just gonna sit down. I'm not gonna dance. I'm not gonna talk. um, but like, yeah, I really like got to see how much my dad's family loved my mother. And I think that was something that like really positively impacted me. And to see like, I don't know, just their like the twinkle in their eye, I guess, when I'd remind them of my mom. Like it felt special, right? It felt connected. Um, so I totally relate to that notion of like everybody comparing you to your mom and such.
Yeah, no, I think we get that, and it's like it's a reconciling of like the past and like what it is now, and like the hopes that people kind of like see in us. Yeah. And I think and again, that in itself it's like very beautiful, but it's also so scary to carry that as a responsibility there and back.
Totally. 100%.
Mhm. Moving on to kind of like more so the internet digital world talk and like portion. I'm introducing a new segment because to this podcast. I usually just had one, but now I have two. And I'm calling it like what's in a name because I feel like my username came about of me being very silly. And you mentioned that you were on my website and it said like Tania does a lot in my about. And like that's the reason I chose my username, where I was like, I want like whenever people are like, oh, who can do this? And it's like, oh, or who does this? Like, oh, Tania does. And that just ended up being my username in a lot of the stuff that I use. So how did you come up with your screen name or screen names? So like Shot of Truth podcast, but also Vimtim, which is how I read your username. Yeah, how did that come about? And if there's like a fun little story behind that.
So first off, your segment being called What's in a Name is very apparent of your romantic language degree. And your love for romantic languages. As you know, we were just in Europe together, heard you speak French, I'd be like, what did they say? But as for my screen names, I mean, Shot of Truth podcast is just, you know, the podcast itself. The reason it was named Shot of Truth podcast is because the first time we were recording, when I started, I had a co-host and we were recording and we were taking shots of tequila because we were so nervous and so awkward. Like I think we recorded us taking shots too. And you hear her say, what if we call this Shot of Truth podcast? And then we're like, that's it. That's it. Like, that's the name. And so that's how that started. And that's how the name stuck. That's why our logo has two little shot glasses on it, for V for Vicky and A for Araceli, who is no longer with Shot of Truth podcast, but is a huge, huge advocate for us still to this day. And then it's so funny. You're not going to look at my name the same anymore, but the VMTMM is actually all of my initials. My full name is Victoria Maria Teresa Matei Mendoza, and so it's VMTMM. So it's nothing like super like special, but I've had that as like my name for Instagram since I got Instagram, and so a lot of people do know me as that specific screen name. And then I break it to folks. I'm like, it's just my initials.
No, it's still fun. I feel like I'll still read it with them. It makes sense. I think visually your name is also like, I don't know, like very fun where with the M's and the T in the middle. It was very visually appealing too to me.
I love that. Thank you for that feedback.
No, I'm always curious. Some people have like sometimes it's just their name, sometimes it's like a backstory. I've had other usernames with different backstories. Like I remember my Tumblr used to be like remembering sirens.tumblr.com because I loved like it was a reference to like some band songs or like sleeping with sirens and stuff like that. So sometimes there's a little more like backstories to stuff, but so I'm always curious about screen names. Maybe a question out of that, is there like any screen names that you had in the past that were like that had a story to them?
Okay, so one that comes to mind is Hiei's little baby girl. And this was an anime character that I was obsessed with from Yu Yu Hakusho. If you love Yu Yu Hakusho and you're listening to this, I see you. But I was obsessed with him. I like was in 6th grade and wrote his name everywhere, had stickers of him everywhere, and everybody thought it was so bizarre. And I had that email up until I got to college. And so eventually I just kind of got embarrassed of it. And just changed it to my name. but that's one that rings to my mind, and that is like deeply rooted in my nerdiness and like my anime loving kind of unique self.
Our next segment is really putting people that you know on, because this series is called The Most Interesting People on My Timeline, but who are the most interesting people on your timeline?
Oh my goodness. I thought about this question, and the first person that came to mind is Carlos Martinez, who is a childhood friend, who is now this massive Latino artist here in the Seattle area, who is doing phenomenal work. I will send you his social media so you can tag him below. And his sister, also Brianda Martinez, who, again, a phenomenal artist. Their family is just full of artistic beings and people that have supported me throughout my life, in like a together way, and also in like what it's like to cultivate relationships at a distance too. So yeah, they're some of the most interesting people on my timeline. But there's one more person I need to mention because I rely and fall on this person a lot for guidance, for listening to their podcast, learning from them. And they're the co-hosts of Tamarino podcast, Ana Sheila Victorino. I literally met her through, it's so funny, I met her through a life coach program, and before meeting her there was a mentor of mine that said, you have to meet Anna Shayla, you remind me of her. And I just like didn't get it. And now after connecting with her, I just think we're both always reflecting, thinking, trying to understand abundance, peace, and just, I don't know, I just like absolutely love her. If I ever have any questions about anything, or like feeling deep heaviness about my father, like she's the first person I think about reaching out to. She's a badass. So yeah, all three of those people: Carlos Martinez, Brianna Martinez, and Anna Shayla.
Thank you for putting me on, because I hadn't like heard about them. But I love that you mentioned some Pacific Northwest folks, because we're both like up here. And like I love this question because some of it, I've even interviewed people that like people have told me about, like that are the most interesting people on their timeline and things like that. So I love this question because it's like community building to me, which is a goal that I had with this podcast. So like already you being like, these people are like amazing and like they're doing amazing work. Like I trust you, so obviously I'm gonna reach out to them and be like, hello.
Heck yeah.
No, thank you for sharing their work with us. And is there anything cool in your future that you'd like to share, or that like is coming up for you that like you'd love people to engage with?
So, I think one of the things that I'm constantly looking to work on is creative projects. And I'm much more motivated when people are like, let's do this together. And so I definitely want to invite and extend the invitation of folks to hop on Shot of Truth podcast, whether that's listening, wanting to be a guest, whatever that looks like. I think that's, one of the best ways to connect with people is literally hearing them out and learning from them through what makes them and motivates them every single day. Another cool thing in the future, I'm going to Salem, Massachusetts for Halloween. And little did I know that 1 million people go to Salem, Massachusetts in the month of October, and that it's going to be absolute chaos. But I'm really looking forward to the witchy vibes, the like, learning about the history of Salem. And yeah, I'm so curious because I don't often spend time on the east side. So it's going to be culture shock, lots of really fun experiences also, since I'm going with a bunch of undocu hermanas that I love so deeply. So yeah, those are some of the things to look out for, and I will probably share about it on my Instagram. So feel free to check that out as well.
Is there anything other like besides the podcast? Because you also described yourself as like a creator. Is there any like projects that you're working on, or that you want to, or that you're looking to be in community with people to work on?
Yeah, 100%. So I'm always doing, workshops, and they vary by topic. I've done various things from talking about the criminalization and exploitation of immigrants in like the context of American history. I've talked about the parallels of mass incarceration, mass detention, as we need to be looking at these topics as joint struggle, right? Like how we are all together in this, in a joint struggle. I've done topics about climate change and migration. Like I'm always looking to do presentations and work with folks from education areas to, staff retreats, all of that. And I'm also, starting to be more open and inviting folks to have more conversations about grief. And so I want to create something. I don't know what that is, but feeling a deep desire to really focus on speaking more to grief and speaking more to alcoholism, in particular within immigrant communities. So yeah, I'm always down to create and build things with folks. So if you have an idea, let's talk.
Beautiful. And let me know when you like, I feel like I don't know if a support group, but like anything with that might be like maybe something beneficial for me too, since like kind of like I mentioned, it's not like grief and like also alcoholism are topics in my family that we don't really talk about, or we talk about in like not a great way. It doesn't really resolve a lot. So I'm excited for you to kind of be leading that work as you're going through it yourself. It's like amazing to have that like drive and strength to do it. So thank you.
Of course, and you'll also see me traveling with CLF for as long as DACA permits, right? And always looking to share information about that and, get people to apply as, we want as many people as possible to go on those sessions.
Yeah, and maybe we could like just like briefly touch upon that of like I think CLF was like such a great experience for me going in community because it was led by people who had DACA and were going to be going on the trips, and everybody had like similar experiences who went on the trip. So it's something I definitely like recommend. And I know y'all already stopped taking like for the next cohort applications, but do you happen to know when like the next applications would be released or for when?
I don't. That's a decision made by the people that created the program. But the best way to keep in touch and keep up to date with all of that is following Scholar Fund WA at on Instagram, on Facebook. We're constantly posting on there. Also checking out the Cultural Leadership Fellowship website. Always updated, always has all the frequently asked questions. We're working on how we share, bits and pieces of all the trips we've gone on. All that information is there. So I heavily encourage you to check it out.
Yeah. Thank you. And I'll also be doing another episode more focused on like the fellowship and the experience itself with some other folks that went on it. And thank you for connecting me with a lot of people for that, doing it like a little roundtable style. So yeah, that's for the future. But is there anywhere where like online where you would like to be found or where people can follow you?
Yes. Honestly, I'm mostly and only active on Instagram. I find managing more than that is too much because I do a lot of social media work for the podcast, for my day job. It's too much. So if you're trying to find me on Instagram. You could either find me at Chartreuse Podcast or at VMTMM or how Tania says it, vet.
Tim.
That you can find me on Vintim.
Thank you so much, Vicky. Like I said, you were such like a light, like a guiding light while we were traveling. And you've actually been supporting this podcast like since before we even met on the fellowship, which like I'm so grateful for. And like you just inspire me, give me so much wisdom, and like thank you so much for talking to me today.
Oh, girl, I feel the same. I'm always here for anything, and I'm super stoked to be on this collective journey with you. Thanks,
Yeah,
Tania.
of course. And kind of like you said, I hope to go and do advanced parole again. Let me financially recover from
I feel that.
trip, but I'm hoping like for the future that I get to go with y'all again.
All of Vicky's work is linked in the description box, and you can head over to taniadoes.com/Vicky Matey for links, visuals, and more content. And make sure to listen to Shot of Truth podcast, like in its entirety. But also, I was a guest on the podcast, and it was really fun to talk to Vicky a few months ago and just debrief on our experience as well. And if you guys want to know more about me, you can also listen to that episode. And it's also available anywhere that you get your podcast, as well as linked below. If you'd like to see bonus content like Vicky giving me anime recs, us talking about Salem and witchy stuff and cemeteries, and you also want to help out the podcast, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/taniadoes and give a little something, and you'll have access to bonus content from episodes moving forward, as well as some other cool little stuffs. And I also want to give a huge shout out to Maida Sanchez, who did website redevelopment and logo graphics for this episode, and will be doing it for the show going forward. Maida, love you. Shout out to you. And you've been a trusted member of the timeline for a while. So love you. Shout out to you. Production and research were done by me, your host. You can connect with me on Instagram and TikTok at taniadoes, and you can subscribe to my YouTube channel to stay up to date on this series, as well as just some other fun videos that I'll be doing. Thank y'all for joining. Thank y'all for coming back. I'm hopefully you will be seeing more of me, fortunately or unfortunately. But in any case, stay connected, stay creating beautiful things, and I'll see y'all in the next episode.